Today we got a couple, I think, kind of left field topics. I'm going to talk about something I've definitely never mentioned on this channel before, which is short-term rentals. I'm not going to talk about Airbnb stock. That's a separate thing. You're probably smarter on that term than I am, but I want to talk about the actual ownership and kind of the risk assessment and underwriting and the whole market of short-term rentals. Mostly a hijacked thesis from a guy named Richard Fertig. We'll link to his stuff below, but I'll talk about that a little bit. How about you?
I want to talk about Fed hawkishness. You've heard the term the Great Moderation, which was a period of prosperity and broad macroeconomic stability. There was little volatility in inflation and output. The length of economic expansions were they expanded the length, right? That you had the 10-year, almost 10-year expansion in the 90s to the year 2000, and then was it 2008 to 2020? You had another broad expansion, low inflation, but the beginning of the 2020s, we started to see a little bit more inflation, and with COVID, this just went haywire. I think economic growth has been constrained by supply shocks, not only from the pandemic, but like geopolitics. You had like the Russian war, you had the realignment of oil production, oil sales from like Russia to countries that don't really care about the Ukraine war, I would say so much. Like India, they buy Russian oil, China buys Russian oil, and so they became the major buyers. And Europe is starting to like decrease the purchases from Russia, and they're going to buy from other places. But that whole realignment of purchase sales is creating like havoc in the market, in the oil markets. You have climate change, you have trade wars, you have onshoring. All these things are like what I consider like shocks to the economic system, the existing economic system. There was a paper that I read, I don't know if the term is from them, but it's called the period of the great volatility. You have the great moderation, and now you have the great volatility. And so the question is whether this decade will be a decade of great volatility just because of these realignments, because these economic shocks. What the paper from ECB, the European Central Bank, what they said was that the transition to the great volatility is obviously not a predetermined outcome. Our institutions have learned the lessons from the past, and they can apply those lessons to monetary policy. The big question is whether the government's, the fiscal part will be, the lessons learned from the fiscal part will be applied, right? So that remains to be seen. Our governments will have to adapt to policies. World growth is pretty much lower, where debt to GDP ratios are extremely high. And so, from a fiscal point of view, they're going to have to be forced to focus on investments that produce results that aren't just spending where there's a hurdle rate, which is essentially probably the interest rate plus a certain percentage. I think also during this period, the monetary policies will be specifically focused on inflation and not so much on growth, right? There's always, the US, I think there's a dual mandate, right? Unemployment and inflation. And I think, the central bank kind of tries to balance both of those, but I think they're going to be exclusively focused on inflation. In the context of elevated volatility and structural change, it's a little bit controversial to have higher rates, right? And so I think for the first time in decades, central banks are going to have to prove themselves that they're going to be focused on protecting price stability. It's going to be interesting to see which central banks are going to be committed to that mission and which ones aren't. And I already have two examples of, I think, two contrary examples. I think the Federal Reserve is going to be committed to it. Chairman Powell is probably going to be very hawkish. I know the central bank in Turkey is not committed to it. And then the question is, how does this impact the market? I really think the market will be going back and forth in a trading range bound until we have a change in policy from the Federal Reserve. But that change in policy can't be effectuated until we have short path of inflation, of price stability, 2% inflation or 3% inflation. One report of lower inflation will not change, that Fed trajectory. We need a sustained downward pressure of inflation. And the only way to do that, in my view right now, is truly putting a dampening force in growth in demand until the supply can catch up.
I have nothing to add to that, except that I just looked today on behalf of a client at short-term treasury rates. The 1-year US Treasury interest rate is 3.48%. That is astounding. It has been a long time. I've never seen that interest rate in my professional life. If I were a macro trader, which I'm not, and I'm the worst macro trader in the world, I would be buying bonds right now.
Yeah,
I would be buying that rate to stick around. I'm not a believer in structural inflation. I've heard smart people argue on both sides.
Oh, I'm not a believer either as of now, because I have faith in the Fed. And on top of that, when the Fed commits to something, they will get it done, right? And they just have to see if the commitment is real. And I think it is real. I really do. I will say though, if you are a long-term investor, like if your runway is 20 years or 15 years, I think this is a great moment to buy stocks.
All right, that's our macro section. Onto our much more micro section. This is purely pulled from someone else's work. I recommend to anyone, if you're interested in this, I'm going to talk about short-term rentals. Think of Airbnb and using a property like a hotel, right? Truly a short-term rental experience. And you can listen to this podcast. It's called The Fort with Chris Powers, I think. And the episode is with Richard Fertig of Stomp Capital. And he clips out, to start the episode, he clips out a quote from Fertig in which he says, this is the key thing for Fertig is developing a portfolio of short-term rentals, right? Like pretty highly specialized, but building, developing, running, executing short-term rentals. And his key insight is that the way that you look at this, the arbitrage in this trade exists because this is at its core a zoning play. And the zoning play is the following. Places where there would be demand for short-term rentals and there is not zoning in place restricting it, that freedom to use the property as you wish is underpriced. The market is not yet recognizing how valuable that option to turn on that short-term yield is, right? So it hasn't been recognized. And especially in places where the zoning it's citywide, right? Or there's a good ecosystem between the short-term rental kind of world and specifically where there is already a tax on it. It's a little counterintuitive. It's like you actually want to go where there is a tax because there's already symbiosis between the locality and the short-term rental kind of community where revenue is being generated and it's going directly to the municipality to generate more revenue and stimulate taxes and all those things. So that was an insight to me that I had never heard anyone say, that zoning freedom that you have in those places where you can run a short-term rental, that one is just underpriced. That option is priced too low at present.
But if you have that, wouldn't you assume that competition is in there? Or maybe are you saying that there is, in many places, there isn't competition?
They're not priced differently. On single family homes, for example, go check the MLS, go look at zoning in one place versus another. This is not priced into at least single family homes, single family residential yet. You're not getting a premium for those zones yet. It's just not happening in actual markets.
Oh, I see. So single family homes usually get a premium once you have zoning for short-term rentals available.
They don't get a premium. It's not there yet. They ought to.
How do you find those zoning laws though? I think it's very local knowledge, right?
It is. So broadly, again, totally hijacking a thesis from an investor who's actually going out and executing on this. There's a lot of cool tailwinds behind this. Remote work is a huge one. The experience economy is another huge one. A lot of reasons why great specialized short-term rental properties should be in great demand in the future. But I think the zoning one is the most interesting one. And the other piece is that in most cases you can imagine you have a $100,000 house and you get I don't know, $10,000 a year in a stable single renter, long-term renter situation, in most cases, you can triple your net operating income on a property by running a short-term rental compared to a long-term rental, if it's viable in that area. Now, of course, you're taking occupancy risk, right? Vacancy risk, the risk that you just don't get people in there, and there's more management, right? And ostensibly more, more to do to the property. But the guy, of course, who's talking his own book says that risk is also totally underpriced. And this definitely got my mind running on, it's sort of an Uberization of real estate, right? Like Uber unlocked a lot of static, kind of stuck, workers who maybe weren't doing anything on certain times, maybe at night or other times, and a lot of cars that weren't being used, right? It really like put to use stuff that was otherwise capital or labor that was just not connected, right? I'm not the first person to compare Airbnb to Uber, but there's the TAM of that, right? Airbnb is publicly traded, right? With public people understand how big the TAM is, but that sort of started to click for me of how big, if NOI can be ostensibly tripled on a short-term rental, that's pretty impressive. Now, of course, you run risk. I actually bought my house from someone who was Airbnb-ing it up until COVID, and then they looked for a long-term renter who ended up being me, and then I eventually purchased the property off of them. So, and that was a terrible sell on their part. I got lucky and bought it at a good time. But yeah, now they could be getting, I don't know, I could be getting whatever good bit of Airbnb income off the property now. So it's not without risk and it's not without volatility, but I think I tend to believe that the zoning thing and the vacancy thing are both mispriced. They're not built in yet. It's not like culturally all the way there. There's not enough management expertise to make that great.
If you think of it from a city planning perspective, like I think every city, town should have, if you're building a multifamily unit of 100 units, some of them should be reserved for short-term rentals. I mean, it's obvious that it's their needs. Like people visit family and they want to rent something. I'm not going to buy like a 6-bedroom house so I can host family every now and then. Like it doesn't make sense. You gotta have short-term rental supply in different places. And so the market will start to adjust for that. Like if you offer more short-term rentals, there might be more tourism also. So at the end of the day, this obviously if there is supply, there might be more demand. It's obvious, that part. And so if you're a policy, if you're deciding the zoning of like a neighborhood or even like a city, I mean, I think a distributed amount of short-term rentals is necessary. It's something good for the city. Unfortunately, like if you don't supply it, it will show up in the gray areas. Airbnb solves an issue. Airbnb or short-term rentals is necessary for any city. I understand there's a housing crisis, but it's still a necessary evil.
We need more housing, period. Yeah, you're totally right. We need more housing for regular long-term rentals. We need more housing that's affordable for the middle class and the lower class to purchase. And we need more for short-term rentals too. Demand for them.
I wonder if zoning rules and rules in general have just become more and more complex over the last 60 years across the US. And as a result, you don't have the ability for, the market to respond with that speed as they used to. I think back in the day, you can order a house from Sears, right? And you just ordered it. The material showed up, you hired a couple of people and you built it. That was it. Then you hooked up, you hooked up water, you hooked up electricity, and in some cases you also hooked up the sewer. A lot of places have septic. That was it. Now, there's tons of rules, approvals, this and that. I don't think the permitting system has kept up with times, right? Like,
I'm glad zoning exists. The lack of zoning is a very bad thing, but has it gotten
100%. Lack of
unwieldy?
zoning is bad. The question is there a more efficient way of doing zoning?
Is there a more efficient way of doing the whole government, Gabe?
Yeah.
I think there probably is. And I'm not talking about the blockchain, boys.
Yeah, no, I mean that's. I mean, you could have. I don't understand why there aren't more government services aren't accessible online, right? Like anybody wants to sign up for stuff. There has to be better ways of doing stuff. I'm sure there are. It's just a question of like, will and money, right? So.